Story number 1. The Forgotten Yearbook. At Crestwood High, the library had always been a quiet, forgotten place. Most students preferred the newer, modern spaces, leaving the dusty shelves and creaking floors to the occasional loner or history buff. But among the old books, tucked away in a corner cabinet, sat the school's yearbooks, dating back decades, except for one, the yearbook from 1983. No one knew why it was missing. Whenever someone asked, the librarian would shrug, saying, "It's probably misplaced." But students whispered about the forgotten class, a group of seniors who disappeared mysteriously that year. One rainy afternoon, Jake, a junior with a penchant for digging up trouble, decided to investigate. "I'm telling you," he said to his best friend Melissa, "if we find the 1983 yearbook, we'll figure out what really happened." Melissa rolled her eyes. "You really think a book is going to solve a decades-old mystery?" Jake grinned. "Only one way to find out." They combed through the library, pulling out dusty books and checking every cabinet. As they reached the back corner, Melissa spotted something unusual, a false panel at the bottom of the yearbook cabinet. Behind it was a single book. The cover was faded, but the title was clear. Crestwood High, Class of 1983. Jake eagerly flipped it open, but something was off. The pages were warped and stained, and the photos looked wrong. The faces were blurry, the smiles distorted, and in some of the group shots, figures appeared to be missing altogether, just faint outlines where people should have been. "This is creepy," Melissa muttered. Jake ignored her, turning to the senior portraits. The students' names were listed, but some were crossed out with thick black ink. "What do you think this means?" Jake asked, pointing to the crossed-out names. Melissa didn't answer. She was staring at a page near the back, her face pale. The page was a collage of candid photos. In one, a group of students stood by the lockers, their faces barely visible, but in the background was something unmistakable. Jake and Melissa. "Is this a joke?" Melissa whispered, her voice shaking. Jake turned the page. The next photo showed the library, but it wasn't the same library they knew. The shelves were charred, the walls cracked, and in the middle of the room stood two blurry figures that looked exactly like them. "Okay, we're putting this back," Melissa said, grabbing the yearbook. The lights flickered, and a loud thud echoed through the library. The door to the library slammed shut. Jake ran to it, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling. The air grew heavy, and the temperature plummeted. A faint voice echoed through the room. "You shouldn't have found it." Melissa clutched Jake's arm. "This isn't funny anymore. Let's just leave the book and go." But the yearbook wouldn't leave her hands. It felt like it was glued to her palms, the pages flipping on their own. The final page revealed a black and white photo of a group of students sitting in the library. At the bottom, written in shaky handwriting, was a single line. "Class of 1983, trapped forever." The lights flickered again, and when they steadied, the library was different. The air was thick with smoke, and the shelves were blackened and broken. Jake and Melissa turned to the door, but it wasn't there anymore. Instead, they saw the students from the yearbook, pale, burned, and staring at them with hollow eyes. "You're part of the class now," one of them whispered. The yearbook snapped shut, and Jake and Melissa vanished. The librarian found the book the next morning, back in its hidden spot. She sighed, locking it away again. When the school announced Jake and Melissa's disappearance, she simply shook her head. Another pair added to the forgotten class. Story number 2. The substitute Westfield Middle School was known for its strict rules and no-nonsense teachers. But when Mrs. Kramer, the 8th grade English teacher, fell ill, the school brought in a substitute. The substitute arrived on a cold Monday morning. She introduced herself as Miss Callie, a tall, pale woman with sharp features and piercing green eyes. Her voice was soft, but it carried an eerie authority that silenced even the rowdiest students. From the moment she stepped into the classroom, something felt off. Miss Callie never used the lesson plans left by Mrs. Kramer. Instead, she had the students write about their greatest fears. "What scares you the most?" she asked, her green eyes scanning the room. "Think deeply. Be honest." The students hesitated, but her gaze was impossible to avoid. One by one, they scribbled down their fears. Spiders, darkness, drowning, being alone. Miss Callie collected the papers without a word, her thin lips curving into a small smile. The next day, strange things began to happen. Tommy, who had written about his fear of drowning, found his desk soaking wet. Puddles of water dripped onto the floor, but no one else's desk was affected. Samantha, terrified of spiders, opened her locker to find it crawling with black widows. She screamed, but when the janitor arrived, the spiders were gone. By Wednesday, the class was on edge. The students whispered about Miss Callie, about the way she seemed to know too much, about how her shadow didn't match her movements. On Thursday, Liam decided to confront her. "Miss Callie," he said during lunch, "what's with all these weird things happening? You know something, don't you?" She smiled, her green eyes glinting. "Liam, why don't you tell the class what you're afraid of?" Liam hesitated, his face pale. "It's heights," Tommy whispered from the back. Miss Callie nodded. "Ah, yes, heights. That's a big one." That evening, Liam didn't come home. His parents called the school, frantic, but no one had seen him. By Friday, the classroom felt like a tomb. The air was heavy, and the students avoided Miss Callie's gaze. "Today," she said, her voice unnervingly cheerful, "we'll write about our dreams. What do you hope for most in the world?" No one wanted to answer. When the bell rang, the students rushed out, eager to escape. But as they left, Miss Callie stopped Emma, the quiet girl who sat near the window. "You didn't turn in your fear paper, Emma," Miss Callie said, her voice a chilling whisper. Emma froze. I didn't have a fear." Miss Callie's smile widened, and for the first time, Emma noticed her teeth, sharp and glinting. "Oh, everyone is afraid of something, dear," Miss Callie said, "even if they don't realize it yet." Emma's parents reported her missing that weekend. When Monday came, Mrs. Kramer was back, looking confused when the students asked about Miss Callie. "What substitute?" Mrs. Kramer asked, flipping through the attendance records. "There was no one scheduled to replace me." The students exchanged uneasy glances. Later that week, a janitor cleaning the classroom found an old piece of paper under one of the desks. Scrawled in shaky handwriting were the words, "She knows your fears." And beneath it, a signature in blood-red ink, Miss Callie. Story number 3. The Bell Tower Street Augustine Academy was an old boarding school surrounded by dense woods, known for its towering Gothic architecture. At the center of the campus stood the bell tower, a stone structure that loomed over the school like a silent guardian. The bell hadn't rung in decades. No one knew why it had been silenced, but the students whispered stories about a girl named Eleanor who had fallen from the tower years ago. Some said she jumped, others claimed she was pushed. Whatever the truth, it was rumored her spirit still lingered. Samantha, a new student, wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. She had heard the rumors about Eleanor during her first week, but they didn't faze her. Until the night she heard the bell ring. It was well past midnight when the deep, mournful toll echoed across the campus. Samantha sat up in bed, her heart pounding. She looked out the window, but the tower was dark. The next morning, she mentioned it to her roommate, Clara. "You heard it?" Clara asked, her face pale. Samantha nodded. "No one's supposed to go near the tower," Clara whispered. "It's locked, but sometimes people hear the bell, and when they do, something bad happens." The day passed uneventfully, but Samantha couldn't shake the sound of the bell from her mind. After curfew, armed with a flashlight, she decided to investigate. The campus was eerily quiet as she crept toward the tower. The heavy wooden door at its base was unlocked. Samantha hesitated before pushing it open. The air inside was colder than she expected, and the smell of damp stone filled her nose. The spiral staircase wound upward into darkness, each step groaning under her weight. When she reached the top, she found the massive bell hanging in the center of the room. Dust covered the floor and cobwebs stretched across the wooden beams. "This is it," she muttered, shining her flashlight around. She turned to leave, but froze when she heard a soft voice behind her. "Why did you come?" Samantha spun around, the flashlight trembling in her hand. A girl stood in the shadows, her long white dress torn and dirty, her hair hanging in dark, matted strands. I heard the bell," Samantha stammered. The girl stepped into the light. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow. "You shouldn't have," the girl whispered. Before Samantha could respond, the bell began to swing on its own. The deafening toll filled the room, making her ears ring. She backed toward the stairs, but the girl moved closer, her feet not touching the ground. "They didn't believe me either," the girl said, her voice echoing. "Who are you?" Samantha asked, her voice trembling. The girl's eyes locked onto hers. "Eleanor." Samantha turned and bolted down the stairs, but the spiral seemed endless. The bell's toll followed her, louder with each step, and Eleanor's voice whispered in her ears. "You can't leave. You heard the call." When Samantha finally reached the bottom, the door was gone. In its place was solid stone. She screamed, pounding on the walls, but the only response was the echo of her own voice. The next morning, Clara woke up to find Samantha's bed empty. The school declared her missing, but a few students swore they heard the bell ring that night. Years later, a group of students dared to climb the tower. At the top, they found a dusty flashlight lying beneath the bell, and carved into the stone wall were the words, "Don't listen to the bell."